Everyone knows about the whole situation regarding Sonic Forces, a game that, during its promotional phase, seemed like it would be the biggest and darkest Sonic game to date, showcasing a war-torn world dominated by the Eggman Empire featuring a new powerful villain. Then, the game came out, and that perspective was thrown right out the window, because what seemed like a really serious game with a detailed and gritty story turned out to be... well, certainly not that. While it still had a more serious undertone compared to the previous few games, a lot of it is also made up of jokes and puns that don't really fit the atmosphere of the game, as well as the actual plot having a lot of holes in it and not being as grandiose as once thought. However, on the 15th of June 2018, 7 months after the game's release, an early version of the game script was found and released online by Windy, featuring very interesting differences compared to the one we got in the final. While a lot of people at the time thought it was fake, and probably still do, I talked to Indy personally to know if it's indeed fake or real and what was the story behind it. I'm not gonna show our conversation or anything, nor was I too forceful on getting many details, but while she can't 100% confirm it's real, if you take a good look at the document, there is a lot of stuff that's basically impossible to fake, including developer comments, multiple script versions, event IDs, timestamps, you name it. All stuff we'll take a look at today. The only real story she could share with me was that someone was involved in some Sonic Forces leaks that happened at the time, mostly story details like Tails dying in the game, you just had to be there, and was willing to share it with her. Since then, she has released the Excel file for anyone to take their own conclusions regarding its authenticity, and while I won't be judging that, I'll be showing you basically every single difference between this early version and the final one. Firstly, I should list the general differences found all throughout the script, so I don't repeat myself multiple times. The first thing you should know, and this will probably make a lot of people click off the video, the basic story is exactly the same as the final one. There is no darker, grittier, bleaker, more sinister version of this story that we have access to, nor do we actually know if that was ever the plan to begin with. Even so, a lot of details are different, and the overall language used really is darker and more serious at some points, with a description of some specific situations even being epic, may I add, also featuring less jokes and tone-deaf dialogue compared to the final. There's a bigger emphasis on the devastated state of the world dominated by the Eggman Empire, and the danger that the resistance lives and faces regularly, as well as the difficulties they face trying to win, which, although get mentioned to a degree in the final game, usually get obscured by the multiple moments where a supposedly serious scene gets ruined by some random pun or cocky one-liner. A lot of things are also better explained, clearer, or make more sense compared to the final game, such as Infinite's backstory, which is explained here and ties in with the comments made by Tails and Amy in Final Judgment, which make absolutely no sense in the final game's context, since this early script predates the plans for episode Shadow. We'll dig further into that when I do get to that stage, however. Also, there are multiple versions of the script itself, being updated at different dates. The document itself was created on the 19th of January 2016, initially calling the game Sonic Wars, the same name by which the game is referred to internally. The script has a total of 5 versions. Firstly, the original Japanese, being the first iteration. While the date for this one is unknown, we can presume it was started and continuously updated around the same time that the document was created. This version also has a quote-unquote literal English translation, which doesn't seem too literal, it just isn't localized really. Since this is the original version, it has several missing and different lines compared to the final, as well as some plot points being slightly different. Secondly, the English localization from the 8th of March 2016. This, while closer to the final, features quite a few terms and lines that ended up being cut due to the Japanese developers not being happy with or not understanding some lines. There also seems to be a Japanese translation of this version. Thirdly, the English script from the 15th of March. This one has fewer differences and corrects most of the issues pointed out from the previous iteration. It also features a Japanese translation. Lastly, another English script from the 23rd of March. While this is the last one in the document, it is not final and does still contain a few differences. It's mostly identical to the previous version, but it also adds some alternate ideas for certain situations in the game which ended up not making the final cut. In addition, there are also several developer comments regarding the script, mostly giving some insight and explaining to Japanese supervisors the meaning of some lines, with said supervisors either approving, asking for more details, or for them to be cut. Sometimes there are whole conversations between the writers and their higher-ups, with the first trying to convince the latter to keep certain lines, working to their favor at times while others it doesn't. Interestingly, besides developer comments, there are comments from Aaron Weber too, who was the former social media coordinator at Sega of America. Those social media accounts sound posts really were the trenches for Sonic fans. Anyways, a lot of his comments are basically shitting on the story or pointing out plot holes or nonsensical things, most of which actually didn't get changed, but we'll take a look at that in time. Also, there's something I have to admit that I don't quite understand, but it's one of two things. Either 1, there was no stage dialogue in the levels like the final, as there are 1 or 2 liners in the script that apparently are supposed to play in a stage but then are almost never heard in the final, which aren't really specified to be part of a cutscene or just dialogue like the ones used in the bosses. Some of these do seem like cutscenes, like the Eggman dialogue in Guardian Rock, yes, that's different from the final, or a scene where Sonic apparently grabs the Avatar's hand in Null space, but others seem like stage dialogue, such as Knuckles in classic Sonic's Death Egg. Or 2, the in-stage dialogue either isn't complete or just isn't in the script, as some of this dialogue that's heard in the final is actually present in the script but is very incomplete. An example of that are these lines from Tails and Knuckles, which are present in the final, although slightly different, but then the rest aren't here at all. That amount of dialogue was probably only decided later into development, when they realized the actual story didn't do sufficient telling. Other big difference has to do with the name of the stages, with some being very different or just placeholders. Chemical Plant is generally called Spaceport, which ended up being the name of a stage in the Chemical Plant location. Death Egg is called Prison Satellite, and Mystic Jungle is usually referred to as the Casino area. Green Hill, Metropolis, the City and Eggman Empire Fortress areas have their final names. On the same note, the script only includes quote-unquote 24 stages, although the number of levels is exactly the same, it just doesn't account for boss stages. Also similarly, the levels would have actually been initially displayed as missions, with their name reflecting what you actually had to do in the stage from the story's perspective. In the final game, the stage's name is simply displayed. Lastly, for general differences, the only voice actors confirmed at this time seem to be Roger Craig Smith and Mike Pollock, as their names are written alongside their characters in the same row at another cell in the document. In this column where they're written though, there are also other things like Orbot and Qbot.mp4 or Mike Pollock and Infinite2.mp4, whatever that's supposed to mean. Now let's actually get into the story. I'll cover the cutscene and world map dialogues by the order that they appear, so everything is chronologically accurate. The opening cutscene is basically identical to the final. Eggman's second line is different, although means the same thing, and his last line, as well as Orbot's, are never said. However, there is a very interesting name in the scene's description: Veltron. The Veltron is, in fact, the Phantom Ruby, it just has a different name at this point. And why is the name different, you ask? You'll see in a bit. There's a developer comment about Orbot's line saying, "Let Orbot say this rather than Qbot," suggesting this was originally said by Qbot, although you can't really see this difference in the document as they simply switched the name. After this scene, we go to Lost Valley, where at the end of it we get another cutscene. However, the early script suggests this opening could have been slightly different. While in the final Sonic appears in the city after leaving Green Hill, here it suggested that the city was actually inside Green Hill Zone. He would get the same call he does from Tails at the start of Lost Valley, although the description implies that he's already in the vicinity rather than in a completely different location. The dialogue for this call is also very different, with Tails mentioning he's never seen Eggman so merciless, and suggesting they were gonna die if Sonic didn't arrive soon, with the call suddenly cutting off. There are developer comments for this line asking the writers to remove the dark words, or at least switch them with others. Another comment says they've switched merciless to serious, with Takashi Iizuka approving of the decision. After completing the level, the same cutscene as the one present in the final would play. In the initial description for the setting of the scene, there's a comment from Aaron Weber reading, "Tails defeats Eggman alone in SA1. Why is he suddenly so weak here? Is it just dramatic effect?" It's kinda crazy how they just left it like that, knowing full well it didn't make any sense, and this wouldn't be the worst offender of Tails being suddenly weak for the sake of the plot. Also, the beating Sonic gets from Infinite is described to be much more intense, being implied that he even warps space to nearly kill him. The rest of the cutscene is mostly identical, although there are very slight differences. Sonic was supposed to give a thumbs up to the crowd watching, the line where he calls for Shadow is different, with a comment from Iizuka asking to change it to the version that made it into the final. And a lot of dialogue is missing here, with Sonic simply asking Infinite what he is and then proceeding to get beat up until he passes out. The screen then fades to black and we get some subtitles explaining what happened since then and the present, with these being identical between early and final scripts except for the third sentence, which has the same meaning anyways. There's a comment from Aaron Weber regarding this, asking if Tails and the Resistance simply let Sonic get captured without fighting, calling it a big loophole. Now inside Resistance HQ, Silver originally wouldn't say his first line, which really only exists to signal that he's here in the game for some reason, with Aaron Weber asking the exact exact same thing. Why is he here? While in the final game Amy says that she dreams Sonic is still with them, and then gets cut off when about to ask if he's something, probably dead. In the original script she would literally say that Sonic is dead. Silver also mentions in the final game that Tails has just lost it, which implies that Tails has gone MIA, but in the original script he specifically states that Sonic and Tails are no longer with them. Afterwards, we get prompted to create our own character. After leaving the character creation menu, when Knuckles says that Eggman's forces have chewed through their defenses at Green Hill after entering the room, he was also supposed to mention Cocoa Island from Tails' adventure. There's a developer comment explaining this addition by saying that it gives the impression of the existence of multiple different areas, and that the war is being fought in various fronts, but that they decided to remove this. There's also a comment from Izuka saying that the finalized version is fine, but asking what Cocoa Island is, which is kinda crazy. Knuckles would have also mentioned Infinite as whatever it is that killed Sonic, instead of finished Sonic. There is understandably a comment asking to change this and to avoid using the word kill. When he introduces the Avatar, they would have actually had a name, being Buddy, while in the final they usually call them the Rookie. In this specific line, Knuckles doesn't call them anything but our newest recruit though. There's a comment regarding this line from Aaron Weber saying, "Let's not call them Buddy, sounds childish," which did end up being changed in the final for something a bit more in place. Charmy's line about how the Avatar doesn't look like much was, apparently, originally said by Vector. There is actually proof of this, namely two cut lines for Espio and Amy, with the first saying that Vector basing his judgment purely on appearances is unwise, and the latter agreeing with him. Knuckles' reply about Charmy and his pointy butt was also originally about Vector and his scaly butt. When this was still unclear, he still called Charmy's butt scaly, which didn't make much sense, but what do I know? There's actually a whole conversation between the writers regarding this serious issue via comments. It starts with someone saying that it doesn't make sense for Vector to be called unreliable when he's big and strong unlike the Avatar, with another comment asking the writers if they made a mistake and wanted to make Charmy say this instead of Vector, to which one of the writers replies that it's obvious the line isn't referring to their physical size, asking the supervisors to leave it like this. Finally, they get a response, certainly not what they had hoped for. The supervisor says that Vector is also bigger than Knuckles, so it doesn't make sense for him to talk to Vector like that. Truly a sad story and the death of a creative mind. It's at this point that we start to get dialogue scenes in the world map. I'll just be referring to them as the scenes before said stage. So this one is the scene before we actually go to Spaceport. The mood of this exchange was originally supposed to be very different. It starts out with three cut lines, one from Silver asking what the next target is, Knuckles responding that it's the Spaceport, and Vector asking why the hell they would target that, with Knuckles saying that they're gonna rescue Sonic, while in the final he says that he just got news that Sonic is alive. Amy would be surprised and ask if Sonic is really alive, with Knuckles responding that he was certain Sonic wasn't actually dead, but didn't want to confirm anything before he was actually sure of it. This contrasts with the final game where he acts surprised giving the news, when he was just kinda nonchalant about it in the original script. Knuckles would also say they've been torturing him for months, not for information or anything, just for fun. Crazy shit indeed. Also, while in the final Knuckles says the plan is already happening, in the original dialogue it seems like he was still trying to come up with something. Silver has another cut line, but it isn't anything really. As for what I think is in-stage dialogue for Spaceport, Espio's lines, although very different, mean the same thing. Vector's first line would have had a playful tone, which ended up being changed for a more serious choice of words. Charmy would have also responded to what he said, but in the final he doesn't say anything. Every other line present in the final isn't in the script. After grabbing the shuttle, we're headed to the Death Egg, but for now we finally find out what's going on with Tails, and there's a lot to talk about. The initial description for the scene states that, in the part where Tails is trying to fix Omega, there are whiteboards covered with equations all around him, as though he's been trying to solve a major problem. This was simply changed to Tails is working on a machine, as requested by developer comment, which explains that there could be problems with the actual content of the equations and that it would complicate things for no reason, so they should refrain from adding complex elements to scenes. The first half of Tails' first line was very different in the first localization, with him saying Sonic's name for some reason, stating that Omega used to work. There's a comment stating why none of these details are necessary, since 1. It doesn't make sense for him to randomly talk about Sonic, and 2. There's no need for Tails to make remarks about Omega functioning before, since the existence of the character makes that obvious enough for the player. This line was eventually reverted to the literal Japanese translation. The part with Chaos was also also different. Apparently, it was supposed to be more of a face-off, not an ambush, with Tails being basically paralyzed in fear. Tails would have also been more confident about the whole situation, saying that he needs to save Sonic. Even so, instead of Tails calling out for Sonic's help, he just accepts his fate and says, "I guess we'll be together soon, Sonic," with the developer comment confirming that yes, he did mean they were gonna meet in the afterlife, with Aaron Webber asking for the removal of this awful line. It's kind of baffling how they even came up with this shit in the first place. In the scene where classic Sonic appears, there was supposed to be a shot where his shadow morphs between modern Sonics and the classic silhouette, which would then lead to the shot where it shows classic Sonic in his entirety. This would have only been possible because you wouldn't be able to tell from the get-go which Sonic it was. It would just be a blue blur, which is not what happens in the final. The script says that if this morphing thing is too difficult to do, they'd prefer to just have that shot slowly panning from his feet to head, being what we actually got in the final game. Also, Tails wouldn't know who classic Sonic was, asking him if he's from another dimension, instead of actually affirming that like he does in the game. There's a comment from Aaron Webber asking why Tails doesn't remember Generations, with the Japanese developer comment agreeing and asking for this line to be changed since Tails knows classic from Generations. There would also be another stupid pun with Sonic Generations, with Tails saying, "You've got that classic appearance, like you're from a different generation. Do you know how you got here?" Jesus Christ. This line is still present in the final, but without the pun, thank God. In general, this cutscene is just completely different in the original version of the script, having basically no meaningful dialogue or content at all. It's just Tails being confused about there being two Sonics. After this one, we get a flashback of Infinite ravaging through the city area, with most of it, if not all of it honestly, being at least slightly different compared to the final. Firstly, it's said that the Resistance members would be wiped out instantly by Infinite. Eggman would have a line where he says that their savior, being Sonic, was destroyed, correcting himself by calling him a martyr instead. Of course, this implies that he has, or fully intends to at least, kill Sonic. There are some comments suggesting Infinite to say this instead, which did happen, but the martyr part was understandably removed. Eggman would have another line after this, however, just saying how great he is, or whatever, which was cut. Apparently Infinite wouldn't have been shown completely at this point in the game, and while in the final there still wasn't any shot where the camera actually stops to focus on him, you could at least catch glances of his entire body in multiple instances. I guess this is supposed to be identical to what was actually done in the final, but the script doesn't do a great job at explaining it, I think. The rest is close to what we got in the game, although Infinite would have had another line after his last one. Strangely, there's a developer comment asking for his laugh to be removed because it isn't cool? What? We then get prompted to play Ghost Town with classic Sonic, and once we return to the world map, we're back with the Resistance once again. In this dialogue, instead of Rouge saying that they're getting ready to banish him, Sonic, into space, she says they're getting ready to execute him, which is probably the prime example of the darker and more serious undertone this early script has, even though it can feel a bit out of place. As such, rather than just being banished to space, Sonic is deliberately being held hostage, with Eggman's plan being to humiliate Sonic by conquering the world first, and then killing him when his spirit had been broken. The rest of the scene is literally identical. Interestingly, the famous Knuckles line,
"None of this is good, Vector. That's why it's called war,"
had some problems during the writing phase since some people involved apparently thought it was unnecessary, also due to it including the word war. There's a comment from the writer saying they removed war as much as possible from the whole thing, but it's impossible to do so completely since the scenario is a war, and the fact that Knuckles can be rather drastic makes it fit. I guess that explanation was enough to convince the supervisors. The description for Prison Hall has sort of a progression plan for the settings in the level. It would go from a corridor to a maintenance area full of pipes, then end with an Alcatraz-like prison area. While the two first sections kinda got merged together, I don't exactly know if what they ended up doing for the prison area can be considered Alcatraz-like, but I digress. Actually, it seems like the whole game accidentally got merged into the corridor idea, which is a bit strange. As for the cutscene after this level, the dialogue is very different, but the meaning is the same. Zavok would say that Sonic's time has come earlier than he expected, but in the final he says that it's the end. While in the game Sonic makes some funny comments about the Death Egg shaking, in the early script he would make even less unfunny jokes. Same thing basically. Some comments rightfully state that the dialogue is a bit tone deaf and that it should be at least a bit darker to match with the intended serious atmosphere, which was completely ignored. I guess it fits with Sonic's personality at the time. I'm glad they never wrote him like this anymore though. Even so, Sonic breaking out of prison is more clearly represented as being a side effect of the larger battle being led by the Resistance, whereas in the final it feels a bit random. The rest of the scene is the same, although it would have featured more dialogue which ended up being cut. Even after being held captive for 6 months, we managed to easily beat Zavok, and the cutscene after this fight is identical to the final basically, although there are a bunch of developer comments regarding Sonic's first line about the Veltron sound effect. This line went through multiple iterations, with none of these being what he actually says in the final. These comments mainly ask for the line to be similar to the Japanese meaning of the sound being a subtle nuisance, not emphasizing its presence so much like the original lines did. Then we're headed for Eggate. The description for this level states that the asteroids surrounding it have been converted into Eggman Land, a bizarre fusion of a manufacturing plant and amusement park. It also says that there are multiple explosions going off, increasing in frequency and intensity as you progress through the stage, both of which are never remotely seen in the final game. After clearing this stage, we meet up with the Avatar and get a mostly identical cutscene to the one in the final, although the tone is a bit more serious since there's no sarcasm on Sonic's end, and he and Knuckles do seem a bit happier to be listening to each other than they actually seem to be in the game. As such, Sonic didn't say his last line, neither did he thank the Avatar for rescuing him. There are a lot of comments explaining the usage of the term friendly face for when they actually added the latter line for some reason. I guess someone really didn't understand what the term meant. The world map dialogue you get after this is also pretty much identical. However, regarding the line where Sonic says he's got 6 months worth of payback he's dying to spend, a comment references a battle with Chaos. Did this mean there were plans for a fight against Chaos? Most likely. Are there any remnants of this further into the script? Nope. Well, doesn't matter, because we're headed for Arsenal Pyramids. In it, there's some sort of scenario that, to be that specific, could have only been an in-stage cutscene in my opinion. The description states that Sonic takes the lead and destroys enemies as he proceeds, with the Avatar following him. A group of upgraded mechs appears, blocking the way, to which the Avatar hesitates and stops. Then Sonic extends his hand to them and would say 2 lines that can never be heard in the final at all, nor anything remotely close. Apparently, this was supposed to be the first usage of the double boost, suggesting its introduction would have actually been thought out and fit into the story, rather than appearing out of nowhere as it does in the game. Sonic would have also been a bit more serious about this originally, saying it might be tough, but we can do this together, which was apparently supposed to be cut, but then it seems this entire scene was cut instead. In the dialogue after that level, Infinite has been spotted in Mystic Jungle, being explicitly referred to as Casino Area, as I've mentioned earlier in the video. Also, Sonic would have originally admitted being afraid/worried about Infinite, saying he'll fight through the fear and give him everything he's got. Comments regarding this say that he isn't supposed to feel defeated regardless of the seriousness of the situation, rather he should feel encouraged and excited about getting a rematch against a powerful foe, which is what we ended up getting in the final and would explain why these lines were cut. Amusingly, there are also comments referencing how this change hadn't been reflected into the Japanese script yet, with someone apologizing for it afterwards and Izuka saying that there's no problem. Then you're headed in Infinite's way, where Silver is already fighting him. He was apparently gonna swear up to the last version of the localization, as instead of saying the classic line,
"Does anyone but you believe your lies?"
he would say, "Does anyone but you believe your BS?" Which is crazy. In the original version, he didn't even say anything here. During his fight with Infinite, the Phantom Ruby falls on the ground. While this also happens in the original script, the Veltron is said to drop with a blue trail. And that's the reason I mentioned about why it couldn't have been called the Phantom Ruby originally, since it wasn't even ruby colored. I guess the color was eventually changed to red to fit more with the fact that the Eggman Empire is represented as red and the Resistance is blue, and having the bad guys as main weapon being the color of the good guys didn't make much sense, probably. The interaction between Sonic and Infinite would have also been much shorter, which makes some things like Sonic sniffing his armpits a bit random, as there's literally no lingual input for him to do that. He's just weird for no reason. Well, weird or not, we easily beat Infinite. In the final, that is, because according to the early script, this cutscene would have apparently played after you only dealt a few hits to Infinite, as the cutscene is described as starting after Sonic manages to land some attacks, while in the final game he does seem a bit more defeated after the boss ends, considering what he says. It could have and probably is meant to be the same way as it is in the final, I don't know honestly. While the actual dialogue is the same, or at least has the same meaning, the description of the beating Sonic takes is also much more intense than what we actually got to see. He would have apparently been startled by the Veltron warping space and reversing gravity, whereas in the final none of this really happens and Sonic just gets stunned. Then he would have been attacked and sent slamming into stone buildings, destroying them in the process and then finally hitting the ground. In the actual game, Infinite just throws 2 balls at him and Sonic even manages to dodge one, then falls to the ground really slowly. Sonic would have also complained about Tails not being there when he needs him, which was removed by request of a developer comment specifying that Sonic isn't aware of what's going on with Tails, so it doesn't make much sense for Sonic to think he's available to help. Speaking of Tails, we're back with him and Classic. In the dialogue before Green Hill, the original version would have seen Tails emphasize the urgency of Classic's help all the more so, since they don't know if modern Sonic is still being held hostage or not, even going as far to say that he's the only one that the world has left to ask for help. There are some comments judging this somewhat, although I can't really get an exact translation. The ones I can get are, I think you have to be so sure that modern is already losing, otherwise you're being judgmental and crazy. If you don't think that way, you'll end up being too assertive and weird when modern has already lost. While I certainly have no idea what the second translation is even supposed to mean, this comment is probably asking for Tails to be less assertive in this situation by saying that only classic Sonic can help, as they don't know for sure that modern Sonic is indeed defeated, dead, or whatever he's supposed to be at this point. After clearing the level, we manage to find Eggman and Infinite. Here we finally get real descriptive confirmation that the Veltron is indeed blue, as Infinite is described to crush a blue pebble in his hands. The lab lockdown in Mystic Jungle, as it's referred in the final, is called Casino Laboratory here. The line where Eggman would get mad at Infinite for letting Sonic live wouldn't exist, nor would Infinite's reply where he jokes about the fact that Sonic being alive is only a problem for Eggman. Comments regarding this last line suggest either removing or editing it, since Infinite is Eggman's quote-unquote vassal, so it makes the hierarchy look wrong, with another comment explaining that it fits with Infinite's bold and brash personality. Since these two lines weren't meant to exist, the scene would have transitioned to Tails and classic Sonic immediately after Infinite says Sonic was powerless against him. Also, Infinite would have noticeably reacted to Tails speaking too loudly, even going as far to say that he thought he heard something. This line was cut early since a developer comment states that this will be easily visible with Infinite's reaction animation in the actual cutscene, so there's no need for him to say that. Additionally, the interaction between Eggman and classic Sonic would be very different. At a certain point in localization, Eggman would reference the fact, with some apparent surprise, that classic Sonic isn't a Sonic from their world, which was cut from the final since a comment also informs that they met in Generations. This exchange would prompt Eggman to talk about the Veltron's power, namely hypothesizing its ability to cause rips in the dimensional plane, which he never says in the game. This better contextualizes Eggman's first line in the Egg Dragoon boss, where he says that such power exceeds even his expectations, which in hindsight you can't really understand what exactly happened to surpass his expectations. The logical assumption would be that the Phantom Ruby is so powerful that it easily managed to defeat Sonic, but the early script makes it seem like he's talking about its ability to cause rips between dimensions. It is also indeed weird that Eggman has no reaction whatsoever to seeing classic Sonic in the final game. Whether he knows us or not doesn't really matter, because we beat him. The cutscene that plays right after this boss is mostly the same, although missing one or two interjections for Tails. The only real difference is Eggman's last line in the original script, which even though has the same meaning as the final one, it's a bit darker as he teases them by telling them to let the anticipation of their death grow. He still kinda does this in the final, but I feel like the early one is a bit more fucked up is all. And once it finishes, we're back with the Resistance, as Eggman launches a new attack in the city. The world map dialogue before Park Avenue is, for all intents and purposes, identical to the final, with only a few words being different. Though interestingly, Knuckles would say them instead of man. Guess they didn't want to repeat a certain incident. The other only real difference is Knuckles telling the Avatar to just head back into the city, not really mentioning the whole saving those civilians part. As for the dialogue after Park Avenue, Knuckles was originally going to be much more supportive of the rookie. In the other versions of the localization, Knuckles would tell them to not get cocky, which is kinda weird since you're literally saving the Resistance's ass. In the final, he ends up saying that they still have a lot to do, being a much better choice of words. The early script also suggests that this is the Avatar's first successful solo mission, whereas in the final it seems like they've already had some. The other two lines are identical to the final, although at one point they literally were identical. To each other, that is. Sonic and Vector literally said the same thing for some reason. Setting up a reunion, we're back with Tails and Classic, heading for Mystic Jungle since that's where Eggman said Sonic is. The dialogue before Casino Forest would have been a bit shorter than it is in the final, although still pretty similar. The actual first localization is already identical to the game. Strange things are happening in the jungle, so we're also headed there as the Avatar. The dialogue before Aqua Road is pretty much the same, though Rouge's line suggests that she's close to where the quote-unquote 2 organic life readings are heading. The line was changed per request of a comment stating that she's supposed to be nowhere near Mystic Jungle, so it doesn't make sense for her to say that. After clearing the level, we meet up with Tails and Classic Sonic in front of the lab, then head for where the Resistance members are gathered. Here, Sonic would initially notice Classic Sonic first and only then Tails, whereas in the final, Tails immediately screams his name, and so does he. Sonic would have also called Classic really handsome, and only then would Tails enter the room and shout, while in the final Tails enters first. This means that the incredible line and pun that is
It's been generations since I've seen you. You okay?
doesn't exist in the original script. Tails' line where he tells what he knows about Eggman's plan is a bit different and would have shown a bit of desperation on his part for not knowing what it is exactly, and Sonic wouldn't say that.
Well, a lot can happen in that time.
The localized versions had this part pretty early on, with some developer comments explaining the usage of that expression, namely the fact that it leaves to the player's interpretation what can actually happen, and it fitting Sonic's personality of not giving up even when there's only a slight chance of victory. There's a response to this comment approving it as long as it doesn't go against the flow of the story, probably because it hadn't been finalized at that point. After this, we go to Sunset Heights, as Eggman and Shadow are once again attacking the city, where the dialogue before it is literally identical to the final. However, the description for the stage, as well as the original lines, make it a bit clearer that the attack on the city is a recent development, hence why the city is still engulfed in flames and destroyed. The cutscene that plays after that stage follows the same basic blueprint, however Sonic doesn't act surprised about there being another Shadow. The line where Sonic says that
He just disappeared.
would originally feature a "whoa" before it, being removed because a comment states that this is a serious scene, there can be no emotions at display. As for the world map dialogue after this cutscene, the line where Sonic asks if Eggman can just keep cranking out counterfeits didn't exist originally, and Shadow would literally just affirm this instead. Also, Sonic's last line was different, as he specifically said what they needed to do to win, whereas in the final he says they haven't figured that part out yet. It was changed, you guessed it, as per request of a comment, asking for Sonic not to be so direct, rather accentuate the need to figure out a solution unknown to them at that point. Right after that, Knuckles hears that Eggman is undermanned at Metropolis, which means you have another set of dialogue just before Capital City, where SPO would originally reference a surprise by Eggman. Of course, you can deduce that he's talking about his secret plan, but it was simply changed to Eggman's plan, probably to feel a bit more serious. The line where Silver says that the name of the operation doesn't matter would have been a bit different, as he literally just doesn't care and asks directly for the tactics, while in the final he suggests having a well thought out strategy, which they never did have. As a result, Knuckles' response would have also been different, saying no feints or jabs and motivating the other guys afterwards. The final version of this line, the one where he says that they're going in hard and fast, has a comment from Aaron Weber saying that it will be the most played line from the game on YouTube out of context. I don't really frequent that side of YouTube, so you guys tell me if he was right. Additionally, Silver and Vector had 2 lines removed in this exchange, apparently being cut since someone thought they would make this too long, adding that, if it was an actual cutscene, it would have probably been fine. Finally, Knuckles' speech was meant to be a mere motivational phrase, as the final adds a sense of camaraderie that the original didn't have. As for the in-stage dialogue for Capital City, it's quite literally completely different from the final. There was much more dialogue from the Resistance that didn't add anything of value, and Eggman's first line would have had him show some concern and even fear, whereas in the game he knows that Infinite will just win. The localized versions of this line have the same sense as the final one, although they're still different. He also pretends that he's losing, only to something that's not really specified to happen, which would really get him mad and ask Infinite to use the Veltron. This would have probably been up for the level designers to decide what would happen exactly for him to get that mad, as that info is not present in the script. Eggman does ask Infinite to use the Phantom Ruby in the final game, but it's used more as a stage gimmick and to also represent the main reason behind Operation Big Wave's failure. After this happens in the final, Knuckles will tell you to stay calm since what you're seeing isn't real, while in the original script he wouldn't have been so composed about it. I'd honestly love to hear Knuckles' voice actor say this, but I'm also glad they removed it since it's pretty out of place. Lastly, Knuckles would say that if they can't get it together, the big wave is gonna crash out, while in the final he affirms that this has already happened instead. Silver would then say that Knuckles really is married to that name, something he also says earlier in the stage in this version. The Silver lines would be replaced by status reports in the final game, which fits better with the whole atmosphere. Instead of having him make fun of Knuckles for no reason while his soldiers are dying. In the cutscene that plays after this level, Infinite's second line is literally different in every single version of the script. The first iteration is a direct translation, so it was never final to begin with. The second version is much longer and Infinite would be really fucked up for no real reason. The third version is a bit shorter, since there were comments asking for it to be made so. Even then, it seems the supervisors were still asking for this to be tweaked, since it's clear that Infinite doesn't think much of the Avatar, so it doesn't really make sense for him to go as far as to threaten to follow them in their nightmares. The last iteration is identical to the final. The rest of the scene is also pretty much the same, however Infinite wouldn't imply that he's about to kill you. After this, you fight with Infinite, and then another cutscene plays. This one is also pretty much identical to the final, although Infinite would mention thinking he saw something, probably referring to the Veltron prototype. But in the final game, he can't see anything of the sort, he's just really confused at how you managed to break out of the Phantom Ruby's reality. Then Infinite gets mad, punches you and flies away, and you're brought to the world map again, now about to play classic Sonic's chemical plant. Before it is dialogue, of course, although being exactly the same. After you finish the level, Tails says in this new dialogue that Eggman's got like 10 terabytes of selfies on the database in the final. However, originally, he was gonna say that the selfies have celebrities photoshopped in them. Yes, specifically saying photoshopped. As is to be expected, there are comments asking for this to be removed because of copyright issues. In the part where Tails refers to the Phantom Ruby's reality as
like a dream so real, if you bump yourself in it, your sleeping self will bruise? It's hard to believe.
he was meant to say, if you cut yourself in it, your sleeping self will bleed. There's a comment by Takashi Iizuka asking to change cut and bleed to other words since they're too strong. Apparently, there was also some sort of mistake made here, as a comment says that Silver isn't here, suggesting someone accidentally put Silver saying this instead of Tails, something that isn't reflected in the document anymore. When this dialogue ends, you're prompted to go to Redgate Bridge where Metal Sonic has been sighted, with another dialogue taking place. In the line where Amy says,
"Way to jinx it! Metal Sonic has been spotted in the city!"
There are comments regarding the original Japanese version where she instead says that she heard someone say that Metal Sonic was in the city. While I can't get an exact translation of this comment, I believe it has something to do with the fact that the Resistance can't take a mere rumor so seriously or as that big of a problem. It was changed to Amy confirming a real sighting of Metal, so you have an actual reason to go after it story-wise instead of chasing a baseless rumor. Well, given that, you do go after Metal, beat him, and then a small scene plays where Sonic and the Avatar have the opportunity to bond. The early version of this cutscene is identical to the game, but there are comments asking if the Japanese expression used for the well-oiled machine line works in English, being that they're so good together they practically breathe as one, or something along those lines. Since that expression doesn't really exist in English, one with the same sort of meaning was used instead. After this, Guardian Rock comes up, with some pretty interesting details to explore. The dialogue before the level, however, would have seen Sonic ask Tails how to stop the Veltron stack when the latter reveals that he found how to do so. In the final, he just says,
"Great work, Tails!"
which kinda feels like he doesn't care. This line was also different in the first localization, as he would ask Tails to share the secret with the rest of the class. It was changed to how it is in the final since a dev comment asked for it, which now makes the dialogue seem a bit disconnected, since Tails just keeps talking about how to stop the Phantom Ruby when no one really asked him anything. Anyways, after Tails explains his plan on how to destroy the Death Egg, Vector would berate him for not shutting its defenses when he was just at the chemical plant's computer, with Tails apologizing for it afterwards. I mean, he's right, but that would expose a crazy flaw in the story, so they had to remove it. Since these lines were originally intended to be included, Knuckles' line accommodated for the previous dialogue, as he says that Tails at least figured it out, with that part being removed from the finalized version. When you got into Guardian Rock itself, instead of the crab robot attacking you, it was meant to be a Death Egg robot piloted by Eggman, with him even having some dialogue, notably asking the Avatar if he couldn't wait another day to die. After you finish playing the distraction, you go to Network Terminal to fulfill the main objective of the mission as Sonic. Before the stage, Sonic would call the Avatar Buddy, which is in place with what we've seen so far in the script. However, there's a comment asking to switch Buddy with your buddy, so it would read how's your buddy doing with the distraction, which makes absolutely no sense since Knuckles not only calls him Rookie literally in the next line, but Sonic is referring to the fucking guy known as Buddy like he's an acquaintance of Knuckles or something, especially when Sonic has already called him his partner before. Anyways, you go to Network Terminal, tunnel, reach the computer room, then you're prompted to go to Death Egg as Classic Sonic to fulfill the other part of the mission. And here is a very strange detail. Instead of Tails calling Classic Sonic the other Sonic, or simply Sonic like he's done throughout the whole game, he begins to call him Alt Sonic. There's also an in-stage line for Knuckles that doesn't exist in the final game, most likely intended to play at the end of the level. After this, you explode the Death Egg, while Eggman and Co watch what's happening from Green Hill. Cubot's line here is different, as instead of making a pun because Orbot said our legs when they don't have any, he'd make a pun about him saying that the legs had been taken from under them when the explosion is above them. Orbot wouldn't respond to this since I guess there's nothing to say really. Similarly, Infinite wouldn't reply to Eggman when he says that they should retreat to reorganize, which corroborates the original intention of having Infinite being Eggman's servant, just following his orders without really questioning him. However, in the first localization, he already does respond identically to how he does in the final, with a dev comment stating that, since Infinite is Eggman's subordinate, it doesn't make sense for him to be condescending. Another comment justifies this addition by making it clear that he's not really being condescending and that it fits with Infinite's personality and other instances where they've already done something like this, so it makes sense for Infinite to, once again, question Eggman's capabilities. In this early version, Eggman also wouldn't reply to Infinite, telling him to shut up. Finish this, you're now supposed to settle the score by storming Metropolis once again, this time as Sonic. And here is where I think we lost something that could have been really great if it made it into the final. Vector and Sonic would be really cold and nonchalant about the food metaphors present all throughout the dialogue, as they were cool for not jumping in on the joke, but these lines sadly got cut. Now seriously speaking, the starting segment for Metropolitan Highway was meant to be very different. It described that the Resistance invades Metropolis in a fleet of flying battleships taken from Eggman's fleet. Then the level would start with Sonic diving off the mothership and evading the city from the air, coming under fire from anti-aircraft guns in the process. Some of this appears to be partially inspired by Sonic Adventure 2's first cutscene too. Unfortunately, none of this is remotely seen in the final, as the level starts with Sonic already inside a random building with a door behind him, which I assume is how he got in. In the cutscene after this level, you get sent into Null space by Infinite. The dialogue in the cutscene itself is exactly the same, however the order in which the lines are said is different, and probably make more sense this way. I'm sure a lot of you probably think that this early script has a crazy storyline that finally takes advantage of this amazing concept that ended up going nowhere in the final game. Well, sorry to disappoint you, because this level is as anticlimactic in the early script as it is in the final. However, there was supposed to be a scene at the start where Sonic apologizes to the Avatar for making them end up in there, then grabs their hand and motivates them to get out. Immediately afterwards, you'd hear the Veltron sound effect and a glow would shoot through them, whatever that was supposed to mean. Even the script says that they'd like to do this, but only if it's possible. The double boost would then activate and they'd leave Null space almost as quickly as in the final, which is a bummer. After you finish the level, you'd meet up with Eggman at the top of the tower, where he'd say basically the same things in the early script as he does in the final. The only real differences are that Orbot originally wouldn't speak, and Sonic wouldn't make fun of Eggman for having no friends, meaning he also wouldn't tell him that he'd had more friends if he didn't speak about himself in the third person. But yeah, Eggman flies off, the screen fades out, and it's time for Imperial Tower. Before it though is some dialogue, which is also pretty much identical to the final, but there are comments asking for Tails to not call Classic Sonic Alt Sonic, which is strange that there's no comment regarding that in the first instance where he calls him that. When you select the level, a cutscene plays before it, being that scene where the Resistance fights multiple clones of Zavok, Chaos, Shadow, etc., also being the one where Infinite creates the fake sun. Here, instead of Infinite sarcastically saying that he misses Sonic since he's been looking forward to finishing him and his annoying friends, he says that he doesn't miss him, but the rest of the line is identical. The original Japanese version has none of that, as he simply states that he'll crush them. Also, instead of asking if they're ready for oblivion, he'd ask them if they're ready for death. Other differences include Omega not saying,
"Target reconfirmed. Extermination mode initiated. Payback inevitable."
instead having much more mechanical dialogue, and Infinite calling the Resistance worms instead of annoying insects. When the cutscene ends, the stage finally starts, and some of its dialogue is actually present in the script, namely Eggman's dialogue and Tails' lines about how the Veltron prototype should be able to cancel out the original, with Knuckles responding that the Avatar will get burned to a crisp before they even get there. His original line is a bit crazier, as he asks Tails if he's asking the Avatar to kill themselves. Shadow would also speak before Knuckles, just asking what it is that the Avatar is trying to do, which was cut pretty early on. Additionally, Tails would be pretty confident about the plan, saying that he thinks it will work, whereas in the final he instead says that
the chances of success are minuscule. It's It's a desperate long shot!
When you complete a stage, there's another cutscene. Here, Tails actually says buddy in the final, with the same meaning as in the original script. Actually, the avatars called that 4 times in the final script. Firstly by Sonic when they get sucked into null space, secondly by Tails when he gives them back the Phantom Ruby prototype in the previous cutscene, thirdly by Tails here, and lastly by Sonic in the literal last line of the whole game. This is weird because sometimes the characters say it like they're just calling the avatar their buddy, but other times it feels like that's actually their name, such as in this cutscene when they jump into the fake sun. These are either oversights or it's literally just that confusing, which is corroborated by developer comment in this specific line, asking if Tails is calling the avatar buddy as if it's their name, or if he's just referring to them as his buddy. The only real thing of note besides this is that Eggman would ask the avatar how they got their hands on a Valtron prototype. Even then, and on another note, the whole early script makes it a bit clearer that things like null space and the artificial sun are just ways that Eggman and Infinite are using the Valtron to attack the Resistance in preparation for an even bigger plan, which is never really detailed, whereas in the final it seems that these really are the entirety of Eggman's plan. Cutscene finished and we're off to Mortar Canyon. The stage dialogue has 2 lines from Silver and Knuckles that don't exist in the final game, and all other lines are missing. Tails' lines, while slightly different, mean the same thing as the final ones. As for the cutscene after this level, the one that plays before you fight with Infinite for the last time, everything is also identical except for Sonic's last line, being a silly pun with Infinite preparing to be schooled and that the class is in session or something. At the halfway point in the fight, there's a small scene where the avatar appears to finish off the latter half of the boss, which would play out identically. After you defeat Infinite, however, the cutscene that plays does have some slight differences. Originally, Sonic's speech about heart, soul and the bonds of friendship didn't exist. He'd instead say that Infinite's virtual reality is no match for an actual heartfelt bond. In the localized versions of the script, Sonic's line is closer to the final, but differs in that he mentions that the things that can't be defeated are heart, soul and love, being changed for the final version as per request of a dev comment saying that the game is about bonding, not love. Additionally, Sonic would have an aside before saying love, which is just so out of place it's no wonder that it was removed. The weird part is how the writers even thought it would make sense to have this in the first place. Anyways, we're off to Iron Fortress next. Nothing to see here really. Tails' first 2 lines are in the script and are pretty much the same, although all the other ones aren't here. And now, for probably the biggest plot hole in the original game, the dialogue from Final Judgement. Firstly, the problematic dialogue isn't even in the original script, only the first 3 lines are here, being otherwise almost identical to the final. The problem is in the next few lines for Tails and Amy, as well as in the description for the stage itself in the early script. The latter says that, around the main shaft of the fortress, cloned bodies of Infinite are suspended in various experimental pods. Furthermore, at the bottom of the main shaft is a vast underground cavern, described to be similar to the central dogma from Evangelion. I really don't see it, but it doesn't matter. In the final, Tails says that this is where Eggman built Infinite, with Amy adding that it's such a lonely place to be brought into the world. These lines, much like the level's description from the early script, suggest that you'd really see test tubes with clones of Infinite inside of them, but that doesn't happen in the final as, 1, most of the tubes are completely white on the insides, and 2, the ones where you can see inside only have Phantom Ruby copies. Now my question is, does this have something to do with Eggman in the first cutscene being in a room full of test tubes? Each one of them has a Phantom Ruby copy with a random assortment of cubes surrounding it, and in Eggman's computer, Infinite is displayed as multiple different cubes coming together. What does this mean exactly? Infinite was fused with a Phantom Ruby, we know that much from episode Shadow, but could Eggman literally just turn Infinite on and off as he pleased, seeing as the one who really controls the Phantom Ruby is him? It would make sense that this could be the case, considering that Infinite was originally just an obedient servant of Eggman, instead of actually having some free will to express his discontent and such. For the longest time, it was believed that these Tails and Amy lines were remnants of a scrapped earlier plot point. However, we do have an early version of the script that is just as vague as the final. Of course, Infinite's backstory was supposed to be different here anyway, since this predates episode Shadow and the idea to include Infinite's backstory there, so it would really seem that Infinite was artificially created by Eggman, or he was simply a byproduct of the Phantom Ruby's reality, considering how he's just absorbed into the Phantom Ruby at the end of his last fight fight. It's just really weird how they managed to leave this early plot point in the final game without anyone really questioning it. I guess that's all I can speculate about it. I'd like to hear what your opinion on this is, so if you've got something to share, make sure to do it in the comments. Anyways, we blast out of the fortress with a double boost and head into another cutscene where Eggman reveals his last surprise, Sonic Colors' final boss. Most of the dialogue is slightly different, but the whole meaning behind the lines is the same. However, there's something really interesting about this scene. In Rouge's line, where she confirms multiple sightings of Shadow, Metal Sonic, Zavok, Chaos and Infinite, she was also meant to confirm Mephiles. Yeah, this is apparently an alternate version of the line in the early script, as the supposed main line, identical to the final one, is also present there. It was probably something the writers just wanted to do if possible, but then the green light wasn't given. And so we get to the final boss. The in-stage dialogue for this is literally just made of cheer lines similar to SA2 or Generations. There's actually a comment from Aaron Weber complaining about this, reading, "We do this every single time. Generations end, 06 end, SA2 end, all of them. Why?" The craziest part about this is that the devs actually listened to him, as no cheer lines are featured whatsoever. But yeah, we triple boost the boss, destroy the Phantom Ruby, and win this war that's been ravaging the world for months. The cutscene that plays after the boss has the same basic concept as well, but there are quite a few differences still. The early script mentions that voices are raised in victory throughout the rubble of Metropolis, but in the final game we are clearly not in Metropolis. The weirdest part is that the early script never even suggests that we're in Metropolis. It specifically states that we're in the Eggman Empire Fortress, so I don't know why this exists. Knuckles would also say these following lines about how the Avatar is no longer a rookie but a hero, which do exist in the final but are placed further into the cutscene. This was changed since a dev comment asked specifically to change its placement, either to before or after here, because it would take away the focus from Classic Sonic's goodbye. Also, Tails' farewell line to Classic Sonic would be really different, and I don't think I can say this with a straight face. I guess this is goodbye. Thank you for helping us out, Sonic. It's been classic. I am so glad this was scrapped because it's a lot worse than the pun Sonic makes earlier in the game, holy shit. The cutscene would end in style with that line, whereas in the final game there's still some dialogue after Tails says his goodbyes, meaning Sonic's speech about fixing the world wouldn't happen. And lastly, we reach the final cutscene, which still has a few differences. Knuckles' reaction to what the Avatar tells him is very different and really random for some reason, he's just talking nonsense. Vector's line about how the Avatar changed his mind seems like it's directed to everyone in HQ instead of them specifically, which is a bit strange. And finally, Tails' only line is completely different. He talks about how Eggman's empire reaches far across the world, so they'll have to keep fighting against the fabricated reality to restore the world back to its real state. While in the final, he makes it seem like everything's really over for good. But yeah, I guess that's about it for the analysis. Sonic Forces is certainly a game that promised a lot, but in reality delivered too little. While replaying and rereading the game makes me realize that maybe it isn't as bad as I thought story-wise, the gameplay is a bit inexcusable still. There are a lot of plot holes and unexplained things that seem to be rooted into the actual concept of the story itself. Since we have access to what is probably one of, if not the earliest version of the game's story, and stuff seems to happen just as randomly or is just as anticlimactic as the final one is. While the game's concept art hinted at a game once meant to be really dark and intricate, as well as seeing the Resistance really struggle against Eggman's domination, a lot of it was toned down probably for rage rating concerns and whatnot, being reflected perfectly into the missed potential that is Infinite's character, one that is finally more powerful than Sonic and that could have been so much more, but ends up just disappearing out of nowhere at the end of the game without really doing anything. Some stuff also goes unexplained, such as why Super Sonic isn't a thing story-wise or what Infinite actually has to gain by helping Eggman. Even then, it's good that this game exists, because it finally forced a paradigm shift in Sonic Team's thinking, since they actually started to innovate again and rethink what they and their fans actually want for the franchise, as making mistakes is a big part of creating something great. And that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would seriously like to read your opinions on this early script and some theories that you might have regarding it. If you have enjoyed it, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed and activated notifications, as these videos take a lot of effort to make. You can also support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member, where you'll be getting early access to videos, your name in the screen at the end of the video, as well as some other further plans I may have. I also have a Twitter if you want to follow me there, and check out my community tab once in a while, where I post quite frequently with video news. And that's about it really. I'll hopefully see you soon.
Friends of old, back from long ago, come again, just to say hello.